sometimes these days I feel like disappearing. It would be much more comfortable to stand behind there, or maybe even hide behind the couch, like when we were kids and watched The Wizard of Oz, and when we knew the witch was coming on, we'd duck behind the couch. If only it was so easy to avoid those evil and upsetting and distressing things in the world, but it's becoming harder and harder. I'm often described as a very peaceful person, and I really can't take credit for it. I'm blessed with an ironic character. Great medieval scholar named Ibn Hazm, in his book, the Book of Character and Good Behavior, speaks about how he used to be proud of his good character, but then he realized what an illusion that was, to take credit for something that he had not created. One day he felt sick, trouble in his spleen, he said, and he became so grumpy and irritable and overly sensitive. And he said, "What's wrong with me? Why have I lost my good character?" And then he realized that it was just an illusion, that he had any control over it in the first place. It's very easy for a person like me to be peaceful. I'm an Americanized Canadian. I have always lived my adult life. And in fact, I was born in a country, Canada, where I was protected by the rule of law. I'm a white person, you know. I had a family that was well off. I had good health care, education. I mean, it's very easy for me not to be disturbed. What really amazed me when I met my first Muslim friends when I was studying in Paris was how peaceful they were. And they were Black, West African Muslims from Senegal, who, as I wandered through the streets of Paris with them, were subject to the most overt kinds of racism that I had never experienced. Maybe some of you are familiar with it in America in past days, or maybe even sometimes these days. But I hadn't been exposed to that. And I was amazed by their sense of equanimity and how they still treated people kindly. And I really wondered where that came from. And of course, not everyone was that way. But I learned that those who had been raised and formed in an Islamic spiritual tradition, a Muslim community that emphasized good character and control of character, because we're not all born that way. So if you're born with a propensity towards irritation and getting angry, there are things that you can do, disciplines, to work on that reaction. And they taught me that. And when I left them and I was so sad, they taught me the most important thing, which is قَدْرَ اللَّهِ وَمَا شَاءَ فَعَلَ. Allah has destined, and He will do what He wills. And they said that in response to my sadness about being separated from them. And they taught me that we have to see everything in life as an opportunity for learning, which is what it means when we say it's all good. Even when it's evil, even when there's a clear evil, it's an opportunity for us to learn about Allah's creation, about God's power, about God's justice, about what it means to want mercy. All of these attributes of the Creator that are placed within creation, the reflections, we come to know something about that. And so every time of suffering, even, it's true, suffering is real, yet it's also an opportunity to learn. When, in the early 2000s, I was at the World Economic Forum. It's a place of trials and temptations, if there is any place. And when I met Senator Patrick Leahy, who is a great hero of mine, and he knew I was from Canada, he asked me about what I thought about the Maher Arar case. And actually, I'd been so focused on other things I didn't know, but he had been advocating for this Canadian of Syrian origin who in 2002 had been seized at JFK Airport on his return to Canada, hooded, put on a plane, and rendered to Syria. He spent 10 months in what he describes as a grave-like cell, horizontal, 3 feet by 6 feet, where he could hear the screams of people being tortured. He was taken out only to be beaten and further tortured. His family advocated for him, and finally he was released and brought back. Now, after many years and in a judicial inquiry, the government of Canada apologized and said that it never should have happened. That there was no evidence that he had ever done anything wrong. The Syrian regime claimed he was a terrorist sympathizer or involved. The government of Canada, the Prime Minister apologized, and this is before the Trudeau era. It was our previous government, which was on the other side of the political spectrum, yet the Prime Minister apologized to him in front of the whole nation and awarded him a compensation of $10 million, which, is saying you really were innocent and this really was wrong. And Senator Patrick Leahy is the only one who stood up again and again and said, rendition's wrong. We cannot collaborate with torturers for our interests. What are our interests, after all? And until now, has argued that there should be an apology. I say this so that we can understand a little bit about what this regime, the Syrian regime, is, that ordinary people, Christians, Muslims, secular people, in 2011 stood up and peacefully protest against. Everything that's happening there began with peaceful protest. And those protesters said, we need to show the world the violence of this regime, and we're going to do it peacefully. We're going to do it like Gandhi. And we're going to do it like Martin Luther King. We're going to do it with people of all faiths and all people of conscience. And when the world sees the truth, they will come in and help us. That didn't happen. Their protests were met with violence, which is predictable. It happened to Gandhi and it happened to Martin Luther King. But the world didn't come in to help them, and they were left alone. So the peaceful protesters then were left with a dilemma. And some came in and used the chaos and the violence of the government to now also commit some violence. And some of them said, there is a justification in the situation where people are being oppressed to fight an oppressive regime. And those people, they cited the Qur'an that revealed the permission to use force for the defense of people with this verse. Permission to fight is given to those against whom war is waged because they are oppressed. And verily God is all-powerful to help them, those who have been expelled from their lands without just cause, only saying, our Lord is God. If God had not allowed one group of people to defend themselves from another, surely there would have been destroyed monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, where God's name is extolled greatly. So this revelation was not for the defense of Muslims. It was for the defense of religious freedom and all those people, wherever they worship, in whatever house of worship. But many of the senior scholars said it won't work. There are rules and limits to using any kind of force, and one of the conditions is that there has to be a reasonable chance of it working and that the harm will not outweigh the benefit. So it was a question of judgment. And some people went ahead and fought, but most of them said, we will withdraw. And chaos ensued, and it got worse and worse. And so what was the response then? The vast majority of people They followed what the Qur'an says when the two sons of Adam disputed and the one son went to kill his brother. And his brother responded in the words of the Qur'an, if you will stretch out your hand to kill me, I will not stretch out my hand to kill you. He would rather be an innocent victim than to have any chance of being an aggressor. And so the vast majority withdrew to their homes and until today are being subject to absolute destruction. Just yesterday, 10 children died in a building that was bombed. These are peaceful people who have decided to put their fate in their faith in God, that if they can't change the situation, at least they will not be aggressors. And others, they did this. They followed the statement of the Qur'an. As for those who are taken in death by the angels where they are harming they are harming their own souls, they will say as an excuse, but we were weak on earth, so this is why we're doing evil. This is why we're responding with evil. And the angels will say, was not God's earth expansive enough for you to migrate somewhere? And so in this case, they left. Hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. They're picking up their children. They're picking up a little bit of food, a jacket, a blanket, and walking. Is their trust in God? Is their peaceful protest saying, I will not be part of this violence? Do we see them? Do we see them? Do we see that? Or do we just ignore that? We think of Syria, we think of Islam, we think of Muslims, and we just think, look at that violence. These people are out of control. But the millions who are passing, we ignore their dignity, the human dignity that they're expressing by refusing to be part of it, by saying this is God's earth and it's wide and I'm going to find a refuge. What is our response? Where is our violence? Where is our peace? My former colleague at Hartford Seminary, who's a Christian theologian, he's a Christian Syrian, Najib Awad, recently expressed absolute despair. He said, it is obvious the world has decided that we, the Syrians, are not part of the human race, but just rats, worthy of extermination. This despair. And in the end, when we despair, we do what the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings upon him, taught us when there's nothing we can do, when no one will come to our help. When he, in a situation of intense persecution in the city of Mecca, and his followers, the slaves, Sumayya and Yasir, and their son Ammar were being tortured brutally. And Sumayya was subject to sexual violence before she was killed, in front of her husband, in front of her son. And when they were killed, and the Prophet Muhammad had no political authority to intervene, he stood by their side and he said, patience, family of Yasir, indeed paradise is yours. That in the end, when we're not able to do anything about evil, we trust that our end is with God, the Creator. And when the Prophet Muhammad came upon a man who was beating his slave, and at that time he had no political authority to intervene in these situations of power, he said to the man, know that God has more power over you than you have over him. Know that God has more power over you than you have over him. Know that God has more power over you than you have over him. It really comes down to power. People talk about violence arising out of fear. But the fear is the lack of power that we truly have over our lives, and none of us have any power. I mean, if success in life is determined by having power, then we're all losers, because in the end, we will all lose any power we have. We feel vulnerable, and there's no guarantee of security, and that's why I stand before you here, vulnerable, in front of you, like we all stand in our lives, where we walk, where we go. We can try to protect ourselves from all sorts of risks, and we should. We use our God-given reason. We work together collectively to have a rational and compassionate society. But in the end, there's no guarantee. And we have to accept that vulnerability. And when I feel especially vulnerable, and when I feel especially insecure and a little bit troubled, then I say the words that the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, taught me, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no power and there is no strength except through God. And I remember that each one of us is determined by that, and that everyone will do what they will do, and that my job is to learn in that situation. My job is to see the opportunity for me to express my reliance and awareness of God's power, or to understand what it means to be in need of mercy, to be in need of compassion, to be in need of justice. And that vulnerability allows me to have the courage to go forward and try to exemplify and put those virtues in action with others for the sake of all of those whose peace is constantly being disturbed. Thank you very much.